Each of these healing sensory programs starts from the assumption that you can't get there from here. We need to recognize that the profound shifts in realities which have already taken place force us to change our concepts of success. Our ability to create a high quality of life in the 21st century depends on our ability to look at the new situations which have thus emerged clearly and honestly. It is particularly easy to see some of the driving forces which have altered the situation of families, neighborhoods, and community. Let me start by looking at two of them. The first is the growth in mobility. In the past, people usually lived in extended families. Their parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles were around them and provided a rich context in which to live. Today, the normal family is nuclear, meaning that it consists of parents and children. And the prevalence of divorce means that we have a large number of single parents and also a rich and complex mix of blended families where divorced parents interact with their ex-partners as well as their new ones in highly complex and often tension-filled ways. The second issue that has shifted needed future dynamics is that we are reaching the limits of growth both in population and in the amount of stuff that can be produced without damaging the environment. At the beginning of the century, it was reasonable to act as though the purpose of marriage was to have a large number of children. Now the need to limit family size is abundantly clear. The absolute necessity to stop the commitment to maximum economic growth is also obvious. The point at which these trends will damage ecological systems dramatically is not yet clear, but the fact that it will do so cannot be argued. The shift in family and community realities is also enhanced by the dramatic lengthening of the average lifespan. In the past, the norm was for parents to be worn out by childbearing and child-rearing. They often did not live much beyond the time when their children were ready to look after themselves, and often not even this long. Now continuing marriages may have as long without children in the home as with them. On the other hand, couples often move from having to look after their children to having to look after their parents. Indeed, they often have to do both at the same time because many children cannot afford to buy homes of their own. I have sometimes tried to shock people into awareness by arguing that middle age is the 5 minutes between rousting your children out of the home and committing to the care of your parents. Despite all these obvious shifts, the rhetorics of family and community are very slow to change. The dominant communicators of our time are still arguing that the only way to manage the future is to commit to endless economic growth, despite the growing evidence that people are more interested in their quality of life than in the pursuit of materialism and consumption. This program will aim to open up the alternatives which seem possible once we admit the need for new directions. Here are some of the topics on which we shall touch. We've always seen families as being united by blood or marriage. Do we need a looser definition, with a family being any small group of people willing to commit to each other's needs? What community processes will provide people with the opportunity to feel they belong, and that their activities make a difference to the directions and quality of life of their neighborhoods? We clearly face profoundly difficult questions. Both our deeply embedded patterns of behavior and our societal norms challenge those families which do not have children. They tend to be seen as odd or unfortunate. In a world where population growth must be limited, and where probably we shall need to reduce the world's population over time, it will benefit society if some families decide not to have children. On the other hand, there are some people who are natural nurturers, who are able to raise healthy children for the future and should have large families. At the other end of the age spectrum, we need to ask questions about retirement. This pattern developed when the lifespan was far shorter and when people of 65 were truly exhausted. Today, many people of this age are still very vigorous, and the population over 90 and 100 is the fastest growing population cohort. Nations throughout the world are wondering how to support the growing number of old people. Could it be that we need to abandon the very idea of retirement and provide people with opportunities to contribute throughout their lives, although at a lesser intensity? These are the topics we shall take up. My guest this evening is Robert Stilger, who is a colleague with whom I have worked for almost 30 years. For most of this time, he has servant-led Northwest Regional Facilitators, a multipurpose organization. Much of its activities have been around tonight's topics of family and community. Bob, I thought we might start from a meeting we organized a number of years ago when we brought together an extraordinarily wide range of people to talk about the family. You tell from time to time a fascinating story about the learnings we achieved as a result of this session. They seem to me to have broader implications for how we may be able to get dialogue between those who seem to have incompatible ideologies.
Well, Robert, I'm glad that you went back to that meeting. It was now, I think, probably about 10 years ago when we brought 100 people together back in the East Coast of America to talk about issues facing families in the 90s. And as we were designing it, one of the main questions was, how do we get people with diverse viewpoints to really engage with this issue in a creative way? How do we get people beyond the sort of polarized positions that many people know they have and cling on to desperately? And what we decided to do is we began the conversation with people in what we called home-based groups that were organized for their diversity. So I'll always remember one group where we had a lesbian mom from Washington State, a leader of the Mormon Church from Florida, a Lutheran bishop from the Midwest, a Muslim working on media decency issues from California, a newsletter writer on families at home from Washington, D.C., and a few others that don't come to mind right now. But people who typically would not be able to sit down in a room with each other for more than 10 minutes talking about family without being at each other's throats. And what we asked them to do was to begin by introducing themselves to each other in terms of their current family and their family of origin. And we knew that process would have some power. We didn't know how much it was going to have. The extraordinary thing that happened was that people stopped talking from their roles and their labels and their hats and their stereotypes and went into their own personal experience and talked about what was important to them. And once they got back to that personal base, we were able to begin getting people into dialogue.
Yeah, I remember them coming to us, like all meetings, there isn't enough time. And I remember them coming to us and saying, we know we can agree. We know that there's common ground somewhere. You've got to give us more time. And we said, well, we don't know where to find it. I mean, we set this up and you have to go home at a certain point. But that extraordinary commitment to believe that under the ideologies, under the hats, under all of the things that they normally knew they knew, there was a commitment to finding common ground, was an experience which I think I've been in some ways processing for the last 10 years and continuing to struggle towards what that means at a huge range of levels, which are some of the things I think we need to talk about this evening, because I think it talks about the incredible shift in the ways we're going to have to manage both one's personal life and the societal life.
I think for me that one of the biggest shifts is that certainly the trend in this country has been one of institutionalizing almost all of our different problems and issues. We'll have an institution that'll take care of educating our children. We'll have another institution that will take care of providing child care. We'll have other institutions that will take care of health. We'll have other institutions that we call jobs that we go to do work and get income. And we've depersonalized so much of our lives. It seems to me that the heart of the struggle right now is to discover ways to bring personalization or personhood back into our lives and move away from the abrogation of responsibility out to those different institutions.
We were just in a conversation, in fact, where somebody who works very much in these systems was saying that she feels that understanding is increasingly shared. And in other words, people know that the institutions aren't working. But the step of realizing that it's going beyond improving the institution, that what you do is you make the institution better, to recognizing that it is the institution itself, it is the setting up of rules and structures and boundaries and barriers, which we have to look at and move beyond, is, I think, the step where a lot of people are still blocked. And I think as you and I have struggled in this conversation, and we've been having it, we find ourselves constantly booby-trapped by it and sort of saying, well, this is the old answer, this is the one we used to know. And to keep ourselves clear on it really is this movement away from the rule-based culture, from the institutionalized culture, to a more intuitive culture, a more willingness to go on a journey together, to accept that one doesn't know what tomorrow will bring, that there aren't neat rules for things where you can say, well, if you fit in this box, you can be helped, and if you don't fit in this box, tough, and we're very sorry, but the rules say we can't help you.
Yeah, a dilemma that I find I struggle with too is that I recognize all that and I buy into it totally, but we still have the problem of what the hell do we do? It's not enough to say that we can't use the institutions that we have right now, because at least as far as I'm concerned, there's a very definite need for a massive safety net at this point in time. I remember a number of years ago, a colleague of mine once told me that if you work on addressing the problems, things are going to get better before they get worse. But if you work on addressing the underlying symptoms, things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think part of the dilemma that we've got right now is that the problems we've got are overwhelming enough that if we don't address them, we're going to be in big trouble. But at the same time, if we don't find some ways to come in at the underlying problem, if we don't have a way to come in at the underlying problem level, we're lost. So how do we do both simultaneously? How do we encourage people to move in new patterns in terms of seeking individual solutions within their own families and within their own communities that are not institutionally based, and at the same time build and protect the institutions that we need for that safety net?
And I think that's the hardest question of all, because those institutional structures themselves recognize they don't work. I remember talking to the Arizona state social security system. They were saying, look, we really cannot do it with our rule-based system, and we know we can't. So we're always fighting against this. For example, they were talking about the fact that more and more people have multi-problem systems, and the whole thing's set up, and it says, if you have this problem, we can do this for you. But you can't look at several things at once. The rules don't allow you to do that. So this gets into, I think, this incredibly complex issue of what does it take to move us through this transition in a way which is as little damaging as possible. Let me give you a very perhaps low-level example, again from the work we've been doing together around childcare. Because there are really two types of thinking around childcare. One is to improve the capacity of people to deliver personal parenting as childcare. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, it isn't totally safe, etc., etc. It's people doing the best they can within their own system. And then there's the rule-based system, which says we can create a childcare system which is perfect, where nobody will ever get damaged, where nothing will ever go wrong, which is obviously impossible. And yet that gets in the way of the spontaneity, it gets in the way of the potential of those people to really care for the kids. And I think it's a wonderful example of the clash between the two processes. One which is hoping for full safety, for everything to be organized, for everything to be got right. And the other one which says, but that isn't how life works, that life does have risk in it. And another one that comes to me is a tragic story about a friend of mine who lost one of their kids when they were out on one of those adventure-based systems. Things went wrong. And it made me think that there's no way, if you're going to bring up kids with risk, which I think you have to, because if they don't take risks when they're growing up, they won't know how to take risks or make sense of their lives when they're grown up. But then the risks will sometimes go wrong. There's no way that you're not going to, if you really have risks in this, that at some point something isn't going to happen, which is nobody's fault. And another thing our culture has to do is when something goes wrong is to say, well, we've got to find somebody to blame for this. Where, in a sense, probably there's no blame attached to it because it was just something that couldn't have been anticipated. And it's such a different way of dealing with the whole world in which we live.
So how do we begin to move more effectively around and away from systems that are rule-based, as you put it, towards ones that really do encourage people to seek out their own individual path?
Well, my gut sense, and part of this is some of the things that are happening in my life, is that they're really two very different levels. One is for each one of us to get more comfortable with, in a sense, living a journey and not living a destination. Being willing to say, I don't know where I'm going to be a week, a month, a year, 5 years from now, but to go with what comes along. And that's not how we've lived our lives. We've known we're going to have X amount of money, we're going to have this sort of job, etc., etc. And that's one piece. The other piece, it seems to me, is to begin to admit that you're going to have to rebuild at much smaller levels than we have normally thought about. We think about the community level or maybe sub-communities, but I'm really inclined to think that we have to get back to the neighborhood, the village, the face-to-face interaction where the groups are small enough that you literally know each other and you can evaluate people's character in terms of personal knowledge rather than what we've got into in our whole political system, which is image making. I mean, we don't know the people we vote for. We know the image that people have done more or less well to create something which we sort of resonate with and say that's the person we want for Senate or Congress or dog catcher for that matter, because we no longer have a contact. So I think it's really, in a sense, both being able, in a sense, to make a soul connection with somebody else at a very personal level, which is a personal growth issue, but it's also setting up much smaller systems where that personal connection can be made and where people can have a village again. You know, it is that old one, it takes a village to raise a child. And we've lost our villages. And as more and more people move into the labor force, there's less and less of a village around because, again, we were talking to somebody this week who said neighborhoods are hollowed out. In some neighborhoods, there's literally nobody home all day.
So in some ways, what you're talking about, or what we're talking about, is how do we begin moving towards a society that's based on relationships rather than based on policies? How do we begin to stimulate the connections between people that recognize and deal with individual situations rather than trying to push everything out to a rule level, to a policy level, to a general case kind of level?
I think that's absolutely right. But how, as you try and work that through, how do you find that playing, if you like? I mean, how comfortable are people when one says, look, we can't make this rule-based anymore, or that doesn't work. You're going to have to rely on your guts, your intuition, your own perceptions, rather than saying there's an expert who will make it right, or a professional will cover it, or whatever.
I think we've all been so well trained to rely on the fact that there are right answers, there are experts, there are rules, there are nice, neat, clean, tidy, objective things that we can organize our lives around. That it's a huge uphill battle to move away from that kind of consciousness. I also think there's some interesting things around gender that are built in here. I remember, there's one study that's done from time to time with school kids, where it's a story that's told about a man who has a spouse who's deathly ill, needs some medicine. They're broke. He goes to the pharmacy with a gun and robs the pharmacy and brings the medicine home to his wife. And you ask a group of kids in the 3rd or 4th grade, what do they think about that? What was right? What was wrong? And typically what happens is you get very different reactions from the boys in the group and the girls in the group. The boys in the group tend to say, well, what was the rule? The guy broke the rule, therefore the guy's got to be punished. The girls in the group say, gee, it's too bad that he couldn't have gone to the pharmacist and talked about the problem. Or, wasn't there another way around this? Isn't there some way that we can really talk about the people that are involved in this? So I think I think that all of us have got different kinds of programming as we get older that force us more and more to being used to being in a rule-based culture with tremendous resistance to saying we've got to solve this individually. But I think there's some room to work with there, and I wonder how we really work on these issues without accessing the kind of gender diversity, kinds of cultural diversity, kinds of racial diversity that we need.
You raise a couple of things for me.
At least
a couple, yes. The first one, I think, is this incredible importance of the feminine-masculine issue in our culture. And I find more and more women basically, I think, unhappy because I see them feeling that too many women, in a sense, have adopted the male-based culture. Margaret Thatcher comes to mind, as the extreme case. And rather than women having moved into the male world and said, we have a different image of what the world should be like, many of them have felt they have to adopt the male-based culture in order to succeed. And it seems to me tragic because if there's one of the themes that I find so much of these days is that we need what has been defined as feminine thinking for the future. And so that's one piece. The other piece, it seems to me, is that I find at this point that really the first thing you say to a group almost determines the reactions you get from it. In other words, you can go into a group and you can give them the clue that they're meant to do it the way they've always done it, and that we're an industrial era group and we're going to play the old game, and they'll do it. But if you go in and say, I believe in a different game, and I'm willing to stand up and play that game, it is amazing to me how many people are willing to play the alternative game. In other words, we've really got two games going on in the culture. And the game that people assume is the right game is the old one. But if they're given almost, it seems to me, sometimes half a chance to say, but I don't like this game, they say, oh, wonderful, isn't that great? Yes.
What you remind me of is one time when I was doing a series of focus groups for a Chamber of Commerce on what the role of the Chamber should be in responding to children's needs in the community. And we did the first focus group, and frankly, it was a disaster. It was one of the most flat discussions I'd ever been in because everybody started trotting out what they thought they ought to be saying or doing. We decided to do a little bit of a redesign. So the next one, I took a clue out of that Families in the 90s session, and I began the focus group by asking people to talk about one child that they knew, excuse me, that had a real need that they felt they wanted to be able to respond to. The discussion that occurred was totally different because it was grounded once again in their personal sense of needs based on a real and direct experience.
Well, that reminds me of what I'm told started the Russian process. And that is a great many of the people who went to Russia said, we will not talk to you as bureaucrats. Well, sorry, that's not what we come to do. We come to talk to you as babushkas, which is grandparents. And we're going to talk to you about what you want for your kids and your grandkids.
What Russian process is this?
Well, this was right at the beginning of Glasnost. In fact, some friends of ours, Robert and Diane Gilman, were part of this, and they were part of the process by which they went over, and they started opening up the question of whether the Russian culture could continue in the direction it was going. Now, the whole question of what's happened is a whole other issue. But the ability to open up people's heads when you take them out of the hats. And increasingly, it seems to me, if we're going to do any good work at all, it is going to be as we can allow, we're going to use force, but isn't the right word, allow people to talk out of their experience, to talk out of their concerns, to talk out of this common feeling that the society ought to be more compassionate, and that there is at least one child that they know that deserves help. And it then enlarge. I mean, if they know one child, then they, in a sense, they have to admit that there are lots of others they don't know. Whereas if you make it a stereotype, well, all welfare kids are, etc., etc.
You know, I know that one of the other programs you're dealing with in this series is going to be talking directly about work. But I want to get into that a little bit today, because it seems to me that we really can't talk about family and community very well or very much unless we recognize what's going on with work. And in particular, I guess what I mean is that right now, at least within America, and I don't know if it's as true in Australia, but people's work lives are the dominant feature of their daily life. And I was really astounded a year or so ago when I read one book by a sociologist named Juliet Shore called The Overworked American, and maybe we can talk about the overworked Australian as well. But one of Julia's points is that if we go back 40 years or so to our parents' generation, that our parents that if we were willing to have the same standard of living now that our parents did 40 years ago, given the level of technology that we have, we would be able to have that standard of living with people working 20 hours a week, or working every other month, or working every other year, basically with half of the labor output that we currently use. But that in the American culture, each time there's been a chance to choose between which would you like, more time or more money, the choice that we've ended up making has been the choice in favor of more money rather than more time.
But it's even more than that, isn't it? We've never even put it on the agenda.
Of course not.
It used to be on the agenda. I mean, it's extraordinary. Up till the Second World War, up till 1939, there was a conscious discussion about less hours, more money, less money, more hours, whatever. And suddenly, after World War II, we got into, we want money. Money, 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 money. And we got into, we are going to drive the culture by credit. We're going to buy more than we need. We're going to have stuff. Lots and lots of stuff.
We're going to drive it by consumerism.
Right. And we're going to drive it by debt. And in the last few years, we've not only not taken less time, we've taken more time for work. And one of my slick ones is we've doubled the size of houses, halved the size of families, so we have to fill 4 times as much space with stuff for each person. Now, that's a little exaggerated, but not much when you think about it. And it really is extraordinary that we have chosen a culture which is creating what I'm calling the decades of stress. The last 2 days, I think the overwhelming reality of the last 2 decades is the increasing level of stress people feel around their lives, around their personal lives, around their institutional lives. And that, as you say, work, somebody was talking about, well, why don't communities work very well? By the time people get home, they ain't got the energy for their communities.
How can you have time to build community or build families if you don't have any time? How can you take a person who is totally stressed out from trying to make as much money as possible, deal with all the things that they have to confront at work, and come home and have any quality time to put into a family or to put into a community?
Yes, and there was a really awful article that came out saying work is becoming the escape from the world. In other words, people want to be at work. It's tidier, it's more convenient. It's the rule-based system. You see, that's the only rule-based system that's left, in a sense. When you're there, you know what you're meant to be doing. Now, actually, that's breaking down, too, because more businesses say you can't play rule-based systems either. But we expect more. We still expect people to have coffee breaks, and we expect people to be able to chat. The number of places where you are, that's growing, too, with a number of places where you're under extreme pressure in your work job, but many workplaces are rather civilized places. And then you come home to a crying baby who isn't civilized, and a neighborhood meeting that doesn't work very well, so why go out? And then you add to that more and more neighborhood meetings just sort of seem to go round and round in circles and nothing ever happens at them, and you say, I don't need to sit here. Or you go to a meeting where, in a sense, all you're being asked to do is look at a policy that the city has already decided and decide whether or not you want to do it, and they say, well, what's the point in doing that? And in my more cynical moments, I think about systems try to perpetuate themselves, and this obsolete system we're living in, the industrial era system, has been brilliant at it, because what it's doing is preventing anybody from having time to stop and say,
break out.
I don't want this. This isn't what I want. I'm so tired. I see so many of our decision makers literally so absolutely fatigued and stressed that the thought of having a new idea
is too much.
It's too much.
But it seems to me that part of there's a couple things that are going on that maybe open up some areas of hope. One is that I think that there are more people who have, if you will, succeeded within the typical work environment, who are starting to say, is this really what I want? Do I really want to be continuing to spend this many hours working to earn money to buy stuff? Or do I want to begin finding some other alternatives in my life? And I'm starting to have those dialogues with more employers. And employers are starting to say, hey, if I want to have the kind of quality work that you can do, there's some ways in which I'm willing to bargain here. And let's look at how you can take more time off, or you can go to 3/4 time or whatever else, and to make that trade-off of getting more time back into your life and giving up some of the money in your life. So that's one thing that's going on. Another thing that's going on is that in some of the conversations that I have with people who are in their late teens or early 20s, I don't find, I guess it's, we have that colleague of ours who talks about how things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster. And so I think within all of these, there's people that are going in exactly opposite directions. So I think you've got some people in that 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old age group who really do believe they're going to get out there and they're going to make a bunch of money and they're going to have a successful job and a successful career. But there's also a growing number of people who are saying, wait a minute, is that really what I want? Look at what that did to my parents. Look at what that did to people that are 20 and 30 years older than me. I'm not sure that I want that kind of lifestyle. So people who are looking at, what do I need to do to get by? What kind of part-time jobs, and incidentally, that's the only kind that are available for most people in that age group, can I piece together to give me enough income to do what I want to do so that I can work with other parts of my life? Now, I'm not going to say there's a trend in that direction, but I think more people are starting to explore that question. And I personally believe that it's only as people begin to explore that question, create some of that non-stress time reserve within their life, where they're able to start concentrating on what they want to do at a family level or a community level, that we really start to see change. Because any of the kinds of changes that we're talking about in families or in communities are going to happen because one individual at a time says, this is something that I need to do. This is a vision I have. This is something that I'm willing to work with. This is a direction that I'm willing to move in, and I'm willing to provide some leadership to my family, to my neighborhood, to whatever else, to get going in that direction.
Well, I'm delighted you shifted to hope, because I think it's really important that the last part of this program is about what's going on. And what I think we both believe is that there's far more happening in positive ways than we see. And the reason it's not very visible is that, again, it doesn't fit the images that our dominant communicators get. I mean, it's not what the academics and the media and the politicians talk about, see, etc. And I was reflecting on the fact that I remember talking to one of the big accounting firms in New Orleans who was bitterly bemoaning the fact that they were getting to the point where the people who used to be driven, and this would say, they were called up and said, well, you've got to work over this weekend. And they say, no. And they're finding out that that is sufficiently common that they can't afford to say, well, that's the way the game gets played. They have to start saying, okay, you don't want to work this weekend, you don't work this weekend. And I think that actually the trend around young people has gone further than perhaps any of us recognize, that more and more people are putting together what's called a portfolio career, where people work some of the time, they work harder when they feel they need to, they work less when they feel they need to. And some young people find it incredibly stressful, and other ones find it just wonderful. And that they don't want the 40-hour job and the narrow commitment, and that's just you come to work, et cetera, et cetera. But another thing I see happening is people redefining family. I mean, we used to talk about family as blood and marriage relationships, and that was it. That was the only sort of family that you conceptualize. And yet I see people creating all sorts of new families just because of commitment. And I'm really intrigued with defining family as any small group of people who really commit to each other. Now, it's got to be a small group, because otherwise, you can only deal with so many people, because with family, you've got to drop everything. If somebody has a crisis and you have to say, okay, that's more important than my work, that's more important than anything else, I've got to deal with it. You can't do that with a lot of people. But I see more and more of that happening, people saying, yeah, you're not related, you're not married to me. But we have created a strong enough linking between us that this is family. This is something where we mutually commit to each other. And so this loss we've had for so long, where you've just had the parents and the kids sort of feeling isolated, seems to me to also be beginning to be cured in our culture.
I think you're right, Robert, and part of that is given that we have gone to the nuclear family level, there just aren't enough people around. There's not enough people within a nuclear family to provide the kind of support that you're talking about. There's not enough redundancy. When something goes wrong, when somebody has a crisis, you need more than one or two people to be able to respond. And at one level, what you're talking about is how do we recreate the extended family where people who are not bound by blood become the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles and the cousins and everything else.
And you see, this gets even more interesting when you start saying that a lot of families will not have kids in the future, will not be able to have kids if we're going to have a viable universe. So we're going to need those people to be aunts and uncles because they need to have kids around them. And so, in a sense, that's another pressure towards how do you find that broadening experience in your life. I mean, people need kids to keep them honest, is one way of putting it. But I mean, as you know, I have to be grateful to you because you've been my family recently, particularly after my illness. And to watch how that integration takes place, particularly with a young woman of 10 in the process, is fascinating to watch. But I think we're all learning from that, just as we're learning from a small group which also came out of my illness, which was a group of people which originally came together to talk about how to cope with my illness and has turned into something totally different, where we have really started just spending 2-3 hours a week or every 2 weeks just listening to each other and deepening our capacity to be personal with each other. And finally, I think two things. First, skills, but secondly, at least for me, some extraordinary resonance with this level of conversation we're doing today, that it's a richer conversation, not because we're doing anything in that room for this conversation.
No, but because we've created the space for the conversation, because we've allowed it to come to life, and wherever it goes is where it needs to go. It doesn't have to have a direction, but making the space for those kinds of conversations to occur seems to me what we need to be desperately struggling to do.
I think that's right, but it's another place where the two cultures clash dramatically.
Of course.
I remember when I was last in Australia, people saying, well, you can reduce Bob Theobald's message to you all to talk to each other. And I said, at one level, yeah, that sounds awfully trivial. But in a sense, I think that really is the core. Now, but it is talk with each other. It's to have conversation. It's not to chat. And we are so unused to a conversation which gets any deeper than the total superficialities. Again, this is just a real flashback for me, but I remember somebody at lunch saying, when men used to get together, they used to talk about things that mattered. And the world has become so booby-trapped that now all they talk about is sports. Because you can't talk about politics because you don't know who's going to get angry about it, and you can't talk about religion, you can't talk, and the space has gone out of the world so we can talk about the things that matter to us. The other thing that I see is this incredible gap between the elites who have one set of subjects which they think we ought to be talking about, and the subjects which I hear people being excited about, which are very, very different. They want to deal with work, they want to deal with learning, they want to deal with family, they want to deal with community, they want to deal with health. And all of this discussion about how well the economy is going doesn't really relate very well.
It feels like somebody's trying to convince you of something?
I think it certainly feels like that to me, but I think it feels like that. And I think more and more people realize that the only people who are really doing well are the top 1 or top 10%, and everybody else is struggling.
I both want to talk about how we try to create, how we try to open up that sort of space. And I want to recognize that at least as I look at where creative change comes from now, it comes from conversations that have occurred in those kinds of spaces where people say, I want to do something. I have an idea. I have a vision. I have something that I have passion about that I want to make happen. And it seems to me that change comes from that level rather than coming from the top level down. And I remember a conversation years ago when we talked about how if anyone had told us that Northwest Airlines would become the first airline to make money by having no smoking flights and become the leader in the industry that is now all non-smoking flights on national flights, at least in this country, we probably would have said, you're nuts. Why would anybody want to do that? Why would anyone want to create that kind of restriction on themselves? But Northwest saw that it was a way that they could go, that was going to work, that they thought was important for whatever set of reasons. I don't know. But that was how that change occurred. You talk about things like the environmental protection movement in this country. The environmental protection movement in this country didn't start because government said we have to protect the environment. It started because large numbers of people said we need to do something, and this is the first step that we're going to take. Somehow that leads me to thinking of one of my most famous quotes in the world from Willis Harman, who many years ago said, "The world changes when large numbers of people change the way they think a little bit." It changes when large numbers of people change the way they think. So what we're talking about here, and I think this, applies directly to family and applies directly to communities, is we're talking about how do we create the space that allows people to change the way they think a little bit.
Well, then there's another piece in Spokane which is very exciting about this, because what has developed in Spokane, which I think is fairly unique, is something called the Health Improvement Project, which probably is not the most specific way of talking about it, so we've got to explain it. But what the Health Improvement Project does is to say, if you have an idea, if you have something you want to accomplish, whether it's going to be something that improves your block, or really almost your family, or the whole community, we will work with you to find the people, the resources, the tools to make it happen. So that when people first change their thought, which leads them to a new action, then they aren't just left on their own to say, well, I've got this neat idea now, how on earth do I go about it? Which in that case usually ends up with, well, it's too big for me, I can't cope. But they've literally got somewhere to go and to say, I got this idea, will you work with me? And while obviously there are limitations on how many can be done at a time, etc., etc., it is a very remarkably different way of organizing a community. And it was called the Health Improvement Project for a very interesting reason, and that was that the hospitals, where a lot of this started from, said if we can make people more self-fulfilled, have more self-esteem, we don't believe that we will have as many medical problems. And that's another topic we're going to get into later in these programs, the belief that health solves problems, that healing solves problems, that a healthy community is going to be a lot easier for everybody to run. And so that's part of this whole flow of the discussion. And I think it is, but you see, the other piece, I think, is that people are almost desperate for this opportunity for small-scale discussion. It's just that it's dropped out. We don't have it really anywhere in the culture. The church doesn't do it very much, service clubs don't do it very much. And I sometimes play with the idea that we created service clubs at the end of the 19th century to look after people because the economic condition and social condition of people was so terrible. We almost need a new set of service clubs which say it is our responsibility to get people talking to each other, that's the core challenge of the current moment. And at least in my experience, while some of this is going on, and more than we know again, and some of our email processes are showing this, it's not seen as a movement yet. It's not seen as something that people do. And I think part of it is we've got to get over wanting to run large meetings. There's this tremendous tendency we want to bring 300 people together, rather than saying, but 5 or 6 or 8 people are going to learn everything 300 people can, and you're going to have airtime, and you're going to learn from each other.
Well, and I think, too, part of the difficulty is being able to keep in mind this idea that we have to work on 2 fronts at the same time. And it goes back to what I was starting to say much earlier in this discussion about working both with the problems and with the symptoms. Let's use your health example as one really good one. I've become totally convinced, especially over the last 5 or 6 months in working with you, that we absolutely have to begin moving in directions that are helping people with their own healing, helping people work in terms of their own energetic bodies, in terms of nutrition, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of personal vision, and that's where health comes from. It doesn't come from our Western medical model. But at the same time, right now, we're totally dependent on that Western medical model working well as well. So we've got to do both. We've got to have the Western medical model, our hospitals and our doctors and everything, working as well as they possibly can at the same time as we promote healing. Take it to other levels. We need to have our schools functioning as well as they can to educate, while at the same time we're developing better ways to be co-learners with each other. We need to have folks that are able to give the best possible care to our children while their parents are working, while we're learning to find ways of putting together these broader, more expensive, non-blood related families that you're talking about. And the list goes on and on. It's like I think one of our most difficult challenges right now is we've got to be working at both of those levels, doing the best job we possibly can simultaneously, and that both are incredibly important. And if we let either one lag behind, we're in big trouble.
But I think that's fascinating, because let's take the health one for 1 minute. What I would like to do because of my cancer is to set up a system where when somebody comes in for the first time with cancer, you can give them the option of saying, look, we can take you through the medical model. We can have you listen to the doctor tells you what you want to do. If you feel comfortable with that, that's fine. A lot of people are still at that point. They don't want to know about the cancer. It's going to kill them.
And that is
it's literally going to kill them.
Right.
Because they can't cope with the level of options which exist around cancer at the moment. But on the other hand, we ought to do a much better job with the person who says, I will need to understand this in order to be able to cope with it. So it's almost a door into the 2 levels. But actually, we've reached a point, and this was not planned, you should all know, which really, I think, speaks to how we want all of these programs to end up. And that is to say that if you can't change things immediately. But you won't change them at all unless you have an alternative vision of where you eventually want to go. So if we want families that are more based on passion and compassion and caring, that's a different way of running the family than we've done it. If we want communities that are more personally, and then you say, well, now we can judge which of the things that are being proposed to change our culture are moving us in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So go back to the schools. Yes, clearly our schools need to change, but we clearly don't have a vision of what we want our schools to be in the long run. So an awful lot of what's going on in the schools at the moment, at least in my mind, is going in the wrong direction rather than the right one. because we haven't got a clear enough vision about what we want learning to be in our culture in the long run.
So instead what we often do in that whole arena is we play games with structures rather than concentrating on what it is that we want to learn and what our vision is for education and learning in a community. And so we look at how to recombine different universities rather than what our real learning goals are, as one example.
And this is where this one comes to an end. No closure as we knew there wouldn't be. But there is a question that I hope you will consider over the next week. Is there a need for family and community strategies to be focused around the needs of the individual, the family, and the neighborhood, rather than to be rule-based as it is at the current time? What positive steps do you know about which is happening around you, and how could you support what you find most appropriate and positive? Thank you for listening. When we talk about education, our first thoughts are always about schools, colleges, and universities. We discuss how to improve grades and scores, about how schools can more efficiently train people to be good workers. Our conversation is impoverished because it runs along familiar lines, rather than asking the questions we need to ask in our fundamentally changed circumstances. We need to remind ourselves of education's real challenge. Until this century, the knowledge and wisdom of the old was the best source of instruction for the young, although there were always new realities to be absorbed. It was nevertheless realistic to assume that past experience was largely relevant to the life that the next generation would experience. Today, the challenge is totally different. Margaret Mead caught the change in a piece she wrote for one of my edited books. She said, "We are all immigrants into a new time." This inevitably requires that the patterns we have inherited from the past must be tested against a new set of realities that nobody sees clearly. Immigrants into a new culture can learn from current inhabitants. Immigrants into a new time face a more difficult challenge. What then is required to educate for a profoundly different and ever-changing future? Up to the present time, most educators are concentrated on developing a more relevant curriculum. However, as the amount of information continues to increase, the time needed to learn all that seems necessary for various jobs, careers, and professions can often no longer be found. We therefore require a profoundly new starting point for our thinking. The individual learner needs to become the center of attention. Each person should be provided with the opportunities required to discover their own unique skills and competencies. This is the same revolution as required as many other fields. For example, the patient should be the center of attention rather than the medical system. Fortunately, there is already movement in this direction, particularly for children up to the age of 12. More and more parents and schools believe that imagination should be encouraged rather than suppressed. Difference is supported rather than discouraged. While the picture is still very mixed, positive change is taking place in many places. The picture changes for the worse, however, as one moves into the higher grades. There is a clear movement toward the belief that graduates from schools, colleges, and universities should have the information and skills needed to hold a specific job. The primary direction of change for students at this level is away from learning to learn skills and toward techniques that will become obsolete in the short run. This trend is disastrous because the world is now changing so fast that people who do not develop learning to learn skills will inevitably be marginalized. While there are many people who are fully aware of the emerging tragedy throughout the educational system, the inertia is against them. Of course, the current trends make no sense, given that more and more heads of companies argue that they need people who can keep up with ever-shifting realities. That job skills are best learned after a person is hired. More and and more teachers and professors are all too well aware that teaching specific techniques does not serve the student. Given the growing sense of the need for new directions, why do we continue to support past models? I remember a professor at one of the prestigious Canadian universities informing me of an effort to renew the campus. His scathing comment was that all the proposals were either trivial or moved in the wrong direction. The problem in education, as in so many other areas, is that it is impossible to challenge an existing system without a vision of what can replace it. It is true that there is already broad acceptance of the fact that the current system was designed to serve a vanished industrial era. But we have so far failed to face the core issue. It makes no sense for people to be cut off from the real world during their educational experiences. Education needs to take place in the world, not cut off from it. Thinking and doing need to be meshed. Imagination needs to be encouraged. People need to take intelligent risks in order to grow. These are some of the clues to the new system we so urgently need, and we shall discuss them during the course of this program. And at the end, we shall suggest a couple of core questions that you can continue to chew on with friends and colleagues. I shall be talking with Kathleen Randall. She has been part of the formal educational system, but is now working outside it, so she can now create new approaches and visions. When I first met her on my last trip to Australia, she was working with groups of young people from many countries. Kathleen, I thought we might start from asking what you learned from this work, and what would you be doing now if you were doing it over again?
Robert, I'd be very pleased to begin here because I learned what I needed to move on with. And what I learned working with the project which was called Global Visions was that young people are yearning for good work to do. That they want to be with adults, that they want to be with other young people, and they want to face the times. They want to know what it is that is happening out there, but they want to know what is the bigger purpose and meaning. And they want to find that out in company with knowledgeable people of goodwill. And this project allowed them to do that. When I look at several of my sites, particularly the ones in Brazil and the Philippines, these were perfect examples of how we can engage young people in the good work, both recreating and creating anew societies and the world in which we live, the societies around them and the world in which we live. These young people formed communities. They had eclectic preparation using art, music, drama. They learnt about team functioning. They learnt about their own emotional health. They had spiritual formation. They learned all of the skills that come with futures analysis. They developed genuine relationships, and they broadened into global connections. And they actually felt themselves a part of the web of life. A lot of the young people in Brazil had actually been on drugs, and they'd been in living the university life of, I'm going to prepare for my own career, look after myself and make as much money as I can. These young people today are living together in communities, and their big questions are totally different. Their big questions are, how can I help? How can I know more about myself? What can we do? What can we do? And they're not depressed. They're very energized. They're joyful. They're happy. But they haven't got their eyes closed. They know the world as it is because they've been taught how to do that in their futures work. So I've learned a great deal from taking part in this project and being the coordinator of it. And what I know, and this is what I want to go forward with, is that young people need genuine relationships, not the relationships that occur in the schools. And I do have compassion for schools, and I do believe we've done the best that we possibly can, but they're not good enough for the times. They're not. There are too many islands of anger, dispassion and grief. And I think that schools, we need to learn how to have fun. We need to know where the true joy in life is. We need to tap the deeper collective and the deeper sense of self. And so the sorts of programs that we need don't actually fit into the boundaries of schools. We need to tear apart the walls, and this has been said for decades by learned people and by people who have been in schools and despaired. But we really do need to introduce once more that sense of interconnection with the local community, but it has to be a bigger one than ever before, because for the first time we're in a cosmic reality. We're not in a feudal society of connectedness anymore. So those are some of the things, Robert, that I learned from this project.
You know, what's so encouraging to me listening to you is something I deeply believe, and in fact I'm running into more and more, which is that young people are really interested. I mean, I hear this rhetoric again and again. Young people don't care. Young people really are quite satisfied. Young people only want to make money. Young people, you know, all of the rhetorics we hear. And yet, when they're given a chance, when somebody actually comes to them and says, look, there is a reality out there, you should be dealing with it because nobody else can if you don't, I find them saying, well, how have we been shortchanged? How can we possibly be living in a society which refuses to tell us what's really going on and keeps on talking about realities that have long since vanished? I was at another Canadian college, and a woman of, I suppose, 22 or 23 came up to me and said, you are the first person who's talked about the world in a way that relates to the way I understand it, as opposed to the way that we seem to be told about it. And I have been so completely turned off by the education process I'm in, and this was a part of a college of education, I hate to say, that I'd sort of stopped believing that anybody really understood what was going on. How have we failed young people so dismally, and how, in a sense, on the other side, can we be surprised that there is so much frustration among young people whose experience of the world doesn't seem to me to mesh at all with what they see in the schools and colleges? And as you say, we mustn't get into the blaming game, because teachers do their best, but the system doesn't work, and you can't do it within the current system.
Well, Robert, I believe the system is formed by ourselves, and that we are the people who have the limits. We, as the teachers and the system builders, and even to a degree the young people in the schools, we have the limits within ourselves. And the issue really is to explore the limits that we have put upon ourselves and to see how we all can collectively grow. And so I really don't want to look too much at the divide between young people and the older generations, because each in our time have had that frustration as we've moved on through the generations. We each bring new freshness and inspiration and courage and vision, and it gets dulled and we become bored in the whole process of education, and then we introduce limits into our life, and we then begin to turn off and we depress all that beautiful energy that we had as young people. And so what I would like to see us as a collective, as an intergenerational movement, try to basically move away from memory and history and move into the realm of imagination. I would like to see us draw ourselves towards a more creative future, rather than be steeped into the angers, the problems, the errors that we have committed in the past, because we all do that individually and collectively. We have a human drama that we're a part of. And so rather than treating that as an illness or a problem, I would rather look at it more as simply the history of evolution, and that what appears to be happening is that whatever we've done, we've actually done it marvellously well, because we're now in a time where we've got this extraordinary vision and extraordinary capacity, and humanity seems, I believe, to be at a point of encouraging and allowing marvellous functions to develop, marvellous visions to be possible that didn't seem to be there centuries ago. So while I can see the dysfunctions and the despair and the things that we've done wrong, I think it is the other part of the equation that I really would like to concentrate on. It's the learning to be in this world with all the capacities we have. I think Teilhard de Chardin expressed it extremely well when he said that we act from only a tiny part of ourselves. Well, the school system actually convinces us that we are actually only a very tiny functional little robot in the system. But what we have to do, and this is what happened in some of the sites, not all of the sites in Global Visions, and I'd like to make a contrast there, but in some of the sites in Global Visions, what happened is that because of the particular circumstances and the capacity of the project, the young people actually began to understand that there is, in fact, a cosmic reality. That yes, some of them lived in small villages in Pakistan, some of them lived in very depressed areas in slums in the Philippines, some of them were extremely wealthy. We had a whole cross-section of young people. But whoever they were, they seemed to know themselves only as a tiny little person in a part of the world. Well, this project actually allowed them to broaden out to global citizens. That's the part of the project that we're aiming at, but also introduce them to who they were in that global reality with little hints and whispers that in fact there is a cosmic reality. And it was the excitement of that and the practicality, I might add, of the project, because it was very practical as well. Those were the things that allowed them to get their hands into some real thinking about where we all are without becoming desperate or impoverished and de-energized as a result of it.
You know, it's fascinating to me that whichever field I look at, and one of the consequences of the type of work I do is I sort of get pulled into all sorts of different areas, and I never quite know what's going to come over the internet or over the telephone or in the mail next, is that there is this radical recognition that we can no longer live with a problem, failure sort of orientation which we have lived with for so long. What's the deficit in a community? What do you have to do to make it work? And we're moving towards the asset thinking, the possibility thinking, the vision thinking. And I see that as one of the huge shifts that's happening in the way we are learning to think. But it really does cut across the image we have of ourselves as people, and particularly of kids, which is that you can't afford to let kids be who they are. That if they do, they will misbehave and they will be destructive. And it seems to me it's exactly the other way around, that it is, as you deprive people of that, the kids, of that sense of who they are and the wonder they have, it seems to me, in their early years, that violence and anger develops. And you know, I'm fascinated by the feeling that what we did in the industrial era, what we had to do in a sense, was to turn people into robots. But it's no longer it's no longer an attractive way to behave, which is the point you've been making. But I always add it's no longer a functional way to behave. So how do we take that vision you had? How does one bring that into a community and say we have a better image, a better vision, which can attract the schools, which can attract people into new ways of behavior? Because I don't think you can force this. I don't think there is a way to manipulate the system into this. I don't think it's done by government policy. It's done by people changing their own thinking. And a friend of mine, we quoted this on the programs before, Willis Harman, said that things change when a lot of people think and do things in slightly different ways. How do we help people to recognize that they have a responsibility in this shift towards a more, first of all, more cosmic reality, but also a positive vision of this cosmic reality? Because I find hope and courage seem to me something which we haven't as much of as we need. And how do we help create that? How do we give people the space to realize that they are players in this creation process?
Well, it's an old village method, but I believe it is current and applicable, and it is the telling of stories. I really believe that what we have to do, and this is one of the things that we do here in our Futures curriculum, is to balance the books. There are so many stories that we meet every day about how things don't work and how bad people are, how cruel we are. And in fact, there are millions of tiny acts of kindness going on all around us. And in addition, there are probably millions of acts of extraordinary courage in the middle of war, in the middle of poverty, in the middle of catastrophe, in the middle of everyday life. And they happen around us, and they appear not to be noticed. We seem to be fascinated with the trivial and fascinated with those things that mirror back to us the image of ourselves as failing, difficult and frail people. And so basically it is learning to look at the world differently and learning to select out from our environment. I don't want to distort. What I actually want to do is to get an accurate picture for the first time. I want to get a picture of we as human beings, the real self that we are mixed up, confused, but still holy and loving people that do things wrong, but yet are heroic, are loving, are compassionate. And so what I would like to do really is I would really like thousands and thousands of stories, and I see it happening actually on the radios and TVs now, but I would like to see it, I would like to see many, many more of these stories told, so that we begin to tell ourselves back how beautiful we are, how courageous we are, how wonderful we are. And then young people don't have to go around depressing their energy and telling themselves that really they are only small selves, that they're really only human. I hear that so many times, we are only human. When in fact, the potential of the human is absolutely extraordinary, and this is what they need to know. So I think it's those people who have seen the world differently, who have a benign aspect, who do have a sense of fun also, to actually get off their butts, get out there, join the collectives, the small movements, the non-government organisations, the parents and friends, all of the thousands and thousands of organisations we already have. We don't need any more, I don't think. What we actually do is we need to liberate the energy and the wisdom that already exists in all of those groups. And sometimes it only takes one person to let the cork out of all of that energy for it to flow. Because if you've been in many meetings where if a person introduces a negative thread, then so often the energy goes down and everybody brings in their sad luck stories and the critical analyses, etc. But it can take one person to turn it around, to offer the positive, the hopeful, to take the courageous step, to be very truthful. So what it is, I simply think it's we need ourselves to have the courage to be honest, to be truthful, to be loving, to be compassionate, to be those things that we truly are. I think those words, the hope and courage, those two words you use, I think they're extraordinarily important, but there is another one too. I think we need to be aware. And it's back to that Teilhard de Chardin statement. We need to be aware that we are more than a tiny little robot who seems to have no sense and purpose in this larger story. We need the huge story, and we need to know our role in that huge story, and we need to become aware of the magnificence of that story. And I believe it is an incremental set of activities that occur. I think it has to be millions and millions of people out there every day releasing their own capacities to do that. But I do believe in leadership. I do believe that there are people who are more joyful, more turned on, more aware, more enlivened, who do have a benign sense about the world. And I really think that they better get out there and they better take their role as leaders, not as despots, not as dictators, but as leaders. Get out there and, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, blow their pipes, sound their music, and let people walk with them and dance with them. So that's some of my answers, Robert.
Well, it's interesting. You raised all sorts of issues for me, of course, in that. One of them is that I like Robert Greenleaf's phrase, servant leadership. It's a great book that he wrote on that. And it hasn't got around as much as I'd like. It's a book called Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf. So that's one thing that you triggered in me. A second thing you triggered was your word real, because that's another thing I hear more and more people talking about. Look, we need to look at both the positive and the negative, and just coming at reality in terms of what actually exists. And that what's wrong is not that we look at the negative, which we do in our culture, but we so grossly overestimate the importance of the negative. So our media are around the negative. We look at what's going wrong. We don't know how to make what's going right exciting. The third piece that I just want to weave in a piece from the last week's program, and that was when Bob Stilger talked about the two meetings he ran for the Chambers of Commerce, the first one which really totally flopped, and the second one which started from, well, we're going to ask you to look at a child that you know that needs help, and then we will move on to talk about what we as a community could do about children. And because that became personal and real to people, the flavor of the meeting was totally different. And so what I'd like to push us onto is, what are the spaces in which the sort of conversation, the sort of storytelling that you're talking about can happen? How do we, one of the things that impresses me so much is that there seems to be so little space for the conversation we're having in our cultures at the moment. Partly it's, we're overloaded, we're overstressed, we're overpushed. But it's partly, I think, that we're also nervous these days about what we can afford to say to each other. There is this sense that so many people seem to be able to get angry so quickly about things rather than having this conversation where we're looking for how to build with each other, how to be creative with each other. So how do we create positive spaces in which people can be comfortable discussing the real, can recognize that dealing with these realities is fun, but it's also stressful. I'm in a small group at the moment where we spend quite a lot of our time in tears, because what we're surfacing is old angers, old frustrations, old difficulties, and they come out with people, and people need to deal with that. And I suspect this process of growth out of seeing oneself as a robot into seeing oneself as a human being inevitably involves both joy and pain. And I really do believe that those two are connected. We try to have joy without recognizing that is the mirror image of the pain of life.
It is. I really think that if we put it into the context, and that's what you've been talking about, that is how we can handle it. That if there is a belief that we have to progress through pain, then I believe that is inappropriate.
Oh, absolutely.
But I believe that, as you say, the recognition of the hurts, the anguishes, the angers, the past injustices, and the present injustices, I might add, all of those things have to be taken into account for us to progress forward. But what we need to do, I believe, in these meetings with others, other than having the courage to be ourselves, and I'd like to not underestimate that, because it is an extremely difficult thing. If people did have the courage to be themselves, they would be able to withstand a lot of the muted anger, overt hostilities, the problems that come when people feel disturbed or feel as though that they are challenged. So I think that courage is an extremely important aspect of it. But I also do believe that compassion with courage is important, and that we need to validate others. That no one is superior. We are all as superior, we are all as inferior to each other. We are all on a journey. And so I believe it's extremely important to never give a sense that the other is inferior, that we need to, in every meeting, whether it be just a small group of people, two people or a large one, we need to validate the awareness that people have. Everyone is seeking love. Everyone is seeking self-worth in their own ways. And so what we need to do first, I believe, is to speak to the heart centre. And I have no qualms about that at this stage in my life. I believe that we've spent so much time in our head, and that actually has been one of the extraordinary achievements of the industrial era. We have had this amazing period where our intellectual capacities have been enhanced to an enormous degree, and I'm enormously grateful for it. But what I do believe is we need to centre, and I believe we need to centre on our heart, and we need to look at everything that we learn through that centre. Now, to me, that's not the soft centre. That is the tough centre. That's where the courage comes from. That's where the energy comes from. And so I think that we have to acknowledge that that's who we are, that we are beings that live in and through love. That's elemental. That's the beginning essence of what we are. And my experience in working with individuals and groups of people, particularly in recent times, is that when I acknowledge that as the beginning point, and when I begin to explore the depth and the profundity of what it is to be a human being, that the limits go, well, it's not so much the limits, the barriers drop. There is an extraordinary relief, an extraordinary acknowledgement that people say, in my quiet times, in my times of highest hope, in my dreams, those are the things that I know myself to be. And yes, I am deeply a caring person, but in my work I can't. And so that's a beautiful place to start. Why can't we? And they say, well, we can't affect policy, and we can't affect the systems and the structures in which we work. And so our task is then to say, well, let's look at this anew. Let's not look at this from the methods that we have used in the past. Let's see ourselves as whole beings functioning out of heart and mind, and integrate this into a feeling, knowing, aware, centered self, and go to work. Go to work from there.
Do you find that people... I think one of the extraordinary things that came out of the first series I did for ABC was the amount of resonance, which is a word I've come to like a great deal. And it was really, look, Robert, you didn't say anything we didn't know. But you did remind us that we know it and we care about it, and we would like to put this higher on our list of priorities, that we are not comfortable. And I find an amazing amount of energy which is mobilizable. And I think your point that you raised some time ago, that one person can swing meetings these days. I really have a deep belief these days that if the first message into a meeting almost determines whether it's going to be a positive or a negative one. That if the first message is, well, we're going to operate the way we've always operated, and we're going to talk about what's wrong, then we're going to have another meeting, a great session about how terrible things are. But if you give people the space to start dreaming and visioning and caring and being compassionate, it is amazing how many people are ready for this and sort of say, hey, I've just been waiting for somebody to do this for me. Do you find that where we are in the culture? Because I think, I've been in this change business for too long, and I think that too many change agents are very much in the business of telling people that there's yet another crisis. We come in and we say, don't you realize that the seas are being overfished, or our kids aren't being educated, or, all of the rhetorics we have, when people, I think, are inclined to say, well, we knew that already. That doesn't really help us. What do we do with the fact that we're ready to act, that we're ready to change the way we move? How do we do that? And that they're even ready to recognize that it isn't a headset that's going to change it for us, but a heart set.
Yes. And I would say back to them too, yes, I think that we better take all of these crises very seriously because they are all very real, but let's not run around like mice on the mill. Let's develop into the extraordinary capacities we have, because we need extraordinary capacities to deal with the issues that we've brought upon ourselves. So let's get about it, because, we are perfectly aware ourselves of the great capacities we have. Most human beings, when interviewed, I was reading recently, believe that they handle life better than just about everybody else in their local communities, that most people believe that they're more optimistic than their peers, etc. we do all have a sense of some great capacity, well, not necessarily great capacity, but capacities within ourselves that have not been released. And in fact, it was the message back from Brazil from these young people. They said the thing that really got them was the visioning process. They said to actually believe in something that is so radiant, so wonderful, something that works, and they had to develop a practical vision. To actually believe that there are these sets of possibilities actually enables us to be more. Now, whether their vision actually comes about or not, whether it was impractical in the long run or too dreamy or whatever, is not the point. What they said, it actually enabled us to be more in the moment. So rather than 100 university students pursuing their dull paths that they said that they were pursuing, there are now 100 active, engaged people working on those very crises, but working upon it in an energised and I might say inflamed way. They've got a lot of thought and energy that's going into the process that they're using.
You know, it's interesting. I was at the Pearson World College, which has students from all over the world, and they've got very good at taking speakers who come in and give them a set of ideas, and because they're all over the world, they say, but it's not broad enough. And when I went into them and talked about the questions we had to deal with, they really didn't know how to cope with me, because I didn't say I'd got answers for them. I said they had got to get into the business of being creative. And my sense was that was extraordinarily exciting to them. And in fact, the one sort of real agreement was, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Pearson World College would drop an enormous amount of its formal curriculum and allow them to become passionate and joyous and engaged. And they saw it very clearly. It's then it becomes, how do you actually allow that to happen? How do each one of us help that process to happen, whether we're teachers or students or parents or administrators, and allow the movement. I mean, what's so exciting to me about our discussion today is we're real clear that the only steps that are going to make a difference is not shifting the curriculum around, making the structures slightly different or even massively different, because it is actually the structure, the fact that we believe in structure in education, which is the problem. We need to believe in flow and process and imagination and creativity, rather than saying, well, if we got the structure right, it'll all happen.
Absolutely. That what we have to do is we have to get the people right, in the sense that it is the people forming the very basis of every pyramid, anything that we ever build. I actually was thinking back as you were speaking then to a project. I went to a Youth Futures conference in Victoria last year, and one of the things that impressed me immensely that is relevant here is that a particular project was dealing with long-term unemployed youth, totally disengaged from their societies, at risk of all sorts of dysfunctions. And so they had invented a project to bring them back into the mainstream and back into work. The one thing they said that turned the corner in a whole range of activities that they had, from mentoring, apprenticeships, job finding skills, etc., was a week activity out in the bush where the young people simply spent time talking about the larger issues of life, meaning and purpose. Who am I? They would take them out to the stars at night and they would look at the stars. They would talk to each other about what it is to be human. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing here? Where are we all going? And apparently it was that week of discussion with each other in genuine conversation that the young people reported back changed their whole way of looking at their world and turn them around to wanting to be engaged. And I understand it's one of the most successful projects run for long-term unemployed.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, I can imagine, I suspect you and I can both imagine the conversations. We're going to spend a week talking with kids about purpose and long-run direction. I mean, are you serious? You know, I can imagine the person who managed to push that through and then got the evidence, because I do think that it is, our only hope is to reconnect people with this deeper spiritual crisis. I think that the other crises are manageable, but the sense of so many people that they have a hole in their belly which can only be filled up by an addiction, whatever it is, to addiction to violence or consumption or to drugs or to alcohol, until we can give people a feeling that their life is worth living, nothing's going to change.
Yes.
And yet that's the work we always give short shrift to. And, we run conferences and we spend every minute in sessions, not talking about what matters to us, but we've got to fill every minute. Just like we've got to fill, in a sense, every minute of our lives. We don't like silences. We don't like events that don't go anywhere. We're not willing, in a sense, to spend time and say, hey, that was an interesting period. We didn't know what would happen, but some extraordinary things happened because we didn't know what would happen.
Yes, I agree with you. And what I find is that once that energy has been released, once people have validated for themselves what they have always believed about themselves, when they've heard other people talk to those parts in themselves and those capacities, and they realise that other people also have dreams and hopes very much like theirs, what it actually does, I believe, is it releases the desire to know more, to learn more, but not only that, it focuses it. Because the more that people get into contact with their precise sets of yearnings, then they know what it is that they need to know next. And so then is released that ability to go out and to learn quickly, to learn well, and get on with the job, because there's something pretty exciting to do, and you want to get on and you want to be able to do it well. And so that constant addressing of the inner yearnings actually accomplishes the academic goals that schools are all the time working so hard to achieve. That what it is, it's the motivating factor is the wrong thing. They're being told, they're being lured by being more attractive, being more intelligent, being better than everybody else, climbing the corporate ladders. Most human beings deep down, well, I suppose I would contend no human being in their deepest centre would see those as worthwhile goals. And so what we have to do is to plumb the depths, and having plumbed the depths, release the capacities to learn, the capacities to be who we are. And that actually is a very difficult thing to do, because teachers are scared of doing it. And why are teachers scared of doing it? Because I'm scared of doing it. I'm a teacher. Because what I'm saying is we each have to face it as an individual question in our own lives. We are all scared of being who we are, because it is huge. It is wondrous what we actually are, and it is actually sometimes a little safer to be very small and to plod along each day and to depress all those wonderful wishes and hopes and dreams that come up. It might appear to be safer, but I think actually the universe has taken the plug out, and I don't think it is possible to be safe any longer. And we've just faced ourselves with these extraordinary crises in order to liberate this magnificent capacity that we have to be.
It's interesting, though, but and I'm going to come to another thing in a moment, but if I were a teacher, and I've heard this, and in fact I've watched teachers try this, and teachers try this, and students talk about inappropriate things, inappropriate in terms of how our culture currently runs. And one of the students runs home to their parents and said, do you know what we talked about in class today?
Yes.
You know this one.
Yes, I do. I do.
If we say to students you should be passionate, they'll be passionate about the things that matter to them.
That's right.
And some of those are things that we say that in our culture kids shouldn't be passionate about, shouldn't be aware of, shouldn't be doing anything with, And that's not realistic. So there are some huge blocks in this process. But I don't really want to take that one up. I want to take up another one, which it seems to me, I can imagine two types of listeners. One of them who said, I thought we came in for a discussion on learning and where did we get to? I mean, isn't this been a little bit wooey and, But I can imagine most of the people listening saying, okay, yeah, I buy this, but what do I do with it? what's a practical step? And I know part of the problem with that is it's a unique one for each person, and that there isn't the step anymore. But I'm wondering if in this last few minutes we got left, there are any clues we can give to somebody who says, look, I'm really turned on by this. This really is what I believe. What would I do? How do I start this process? How do I get more comfortable with believing that my passions are important, that believing that compassion is important, that opening myself up and taking risks makes sense and is less risky than not taking risks?
In the long run, yes.
Yes.
Well, it is, as you know, an extremely difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best. I believe that each individual deep down knows what they can do and what they ought to do. And so the first step for me always is to get in touch. Now, in many societies that is very difficult, because I think it was some of Margaret Mead's work where they say that we in the West have lost contact with our soul. So perhaps, and again, we might be getting back to the area where you're saying, the woo-woo area, that we need to get in touch with the deepest part in what, it doesn't matter what religion or no religion we have, but the deepest part of what we know to be ourselves, and trust it. That's the next part. Trust it to know what to do. So to learn to take those quiet times, or learn to do it in whatever way is our way, whether it be through music or walking or running or however we do it, but getting in touch with the deepest part of ourselves and then going with what we hear there, find there, or are inspired by. Trust ourselves, and quite often what it does is it simply sends us out there to learn more. And so that's when and that learning more might be as simple as TAFE courses. It might be going back to school, funnily enough, for someone who's outside the system. It might be picking up our own private learning project through reading and mentoring and getting on the internet and finding out who knows what out there. I mean, there are a million different ways for us to learn how to do what we have to do. We are really good, actually, at education, I believe, these days, in the micro forms of education. We are really good at doing what we're doing. We've got heaps and heaps of stuff out there that can teach people what they want to know. What we haven't really got well done is finding out what people really need to know, what they want to do, and how they can increase that ability to know what is appropriate for them at any step in their lives. And so that's the first point for me. It's the getting in touch with a deeper part of the self. To me, it always goes back to that, to the self, to the knowledge of who you are as the individual and collective. And I think I'll just make a quick comment on what you said before. This search is a supported search, so that when young people might want to unleash those passionate aspects of themselves, this is where the wisdom of an intergenerational project comes in. This is where you need people of expertise, of street skill, and the capacity to be able to help young people to discern what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Otherwise, otherwise you could get problems that would be best not to have. It is a supported collective process. So I don't think I can say much more.
I think you said a lot. But what I want to do, because it sometimes sounds a little bit floaty, is to talk about this at a very low level indeed. We have these people who don't learn to read.
Yes.
And we run them again and again through the same system and say, we will teach you to read by teaching you to read.
Uh-huh.
And my argument is that what we need to do is to provide them with a passion, so that then they will say, in order to meet that passion, I have to read. So this isn't sort of just for people who are high-flown and further along and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. It really is, and it speaks in exactly the same way as that group of unemployed does, that if you can't reach people and say to them their life is worth living, they need to read, they need to be involved, they will continue simply to stick outside the system and say, we're not going to care. So it is immensely practical advice, in my opinion, as well as speaking to the much deeper levels which we need to speak to. One of the things that I've become more and more convinced about, and I know we're getting very close to the end, is the need for really small groups of people who can help each other, that at a certain point one gets to the point where one's done some of one's work and one needs to relate to other people who have done some of it, because at least for me, I begin to discover that the way people do their work is so incredibly different, and in so discovering, it broadens my whole perspective, not only on those people, which is very important to me, but also on how this extraordinarily difficult cultural change which we're engaged in can happen. You have a comment on that?
Well, first I'd like to talk about that example that you gave of the child who can't read. I would never try to teach, well, let's put it this way. If a child had great difficulty in reading, I would switch tack. I would look for what they are very, very good at doing. What is their particular potential? What is the way that they decipher the world? And what is the better way that they communicate? And I would increase their ability to trust those potentials within themselves, and then out of a sense of okayness, then when they have the ability to do so, tackle the more difficult issue of reading. And I know it's one of those sacred cows in our society, this thing about reading marks on a piece of paper, when some people don't come into this world to read marks on pieces of paper. They might have this most amazing imaginative capacity which can liberate other people, but yet if we insist that they learn how to read these marks on pieces of paper, they may never know that. So that's one comment that I would like to make. And the other comment is that we do all need support, and it is that it's almost like that AA support. I thought of that ages ago when you were talking here. That group of people meeting together as genuine, committed people who are looking and searching to improve their own lives and to find out how they can better themselves and through all their different relationships in life improve themselves. And I think, yes, we do need formal methods for this to actually occur, but I also do believe that there are many, many avenues already out there. We don't have to invent any more. There are already endless clubs, associations, non-government organisations, etc. People of goodwill need to join them.
I'm going to have to cut you off because the time has run out, and leave a question hopefully for our listeners to think about and ponder over for the next week. If we need to touch our deepest centers and engage our patterns, how would this change your personal life and the community of which you're part? How could we engage our passions in our home, our work, and our community lives? Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Robert.